A very warm welcome to all of you joining us today. Now it is the 18th of June 2024. On this day we recognize the International Day of Countering Hate Speech. Now at some point of our lives we have experienced some level or some sort of experience in terms of hate speech. This day serves all of us as a powerful reminder of our duty to foster dialogues and understanding within our communities. From the studios of ITN, we are coming to you with an exclusive discussion with Mr. Marc-André Franche, Resident Coordinator for the United Nations here in Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us today. And how are you doing today?
A real pleasure to be here, and thanks to you, Mariela, and to ITN for this invitation to speak about and to discuss about a very important issue.
Definitely. This is a topic that is prevalent not only in Sri Lanka but around the world. As a very basic question and as cliche as it sounds, I would like to invite you to start off our discussion today with how do you see or how do you characterize hate speech?
So, there is no globally legally recognized definition of what hate speech is. There are some principles. There's something called the Rabat threshold, which is some sort of agreement between states about different levels of hate speech. But to be, direct, I think there is a definition that is used by the Secretary General of the United Nations in his strategy against hate speech and disinformation, which is essentially all forms of communication. It can be written or online or behaviors that use derogatory or hateful language against people for who they are. So meaning for their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual identity, or any other aspect of who they are. So that is essentially what hate speech is.
Do you see any targeted audiences that are affected by hate speech?
So, globally, almost 70% of all hate speech, according to the UN, is directed at minorities. And of course, these minorities might be different from one country to another, and towards women, who also account for an important portion of hate speech. Here in Sri Lanka, about half of the hate speech that we've been monitoring over the last 5 years, about half is directed towards women, either intimate partner hate speech, but also increasingly, unfortunately, directed at women leaders, women who speak up, including women parliamentarians. So women are certainly one target of hate speech, but also minorities. In Sri Lanka, it accounts for about 30% of hate speech is directed at ethnic or religious minorities.
Just to add in just one tiny question, sometimes we see this fine line between freedom of speech and hate speech. How would we sort of differentiate between the two sometimes?
Well, freedom of expression is extremely important, and hate speech doesn't erode freedom of expression. I think at the contrary. I think like any conversation about freedom of expression, my freedom stops when your freedom starts, yes? And so any sort of framework for freedom of expression does have limits. And we believe that hate speech is one of those limits, where you need to put a line. There has to be a threshold where you cannot just say anything at any time. And I think the threshold that hate speech puts on speech, which is that you can have an opinion, you can have a diverting opinion, you can have a wrong opinion. That's not the point. And you can say anything. But when that speech, when that communication, when that expression falls into an attack because of who you are, because of who you identify yourself with, that is unacceptable. That is no longer free speech. This is hate speech.
And it is quite unfortunate because many people misuse freedom of expression to sort of draw hate towards people, which should not be the case. Which leads me into my next question. Now, the impact of social cohesion, right? And do you think it deeply sort of divides communities even further?
Absolutely, and I mean, globally, there has been, and of course this is because communication has changed, because the way we use communication, and I guess the explosion of information and technology, hate speech and misinformation are not new. There has been disinformation since, I guess, we are settling, in urban areas, and since politics exists. So it's not new. But what is new is this absolute explosion of channels and of ways of communication. And at a time where, let's say, 50, 60, 70 years ago, there were centralized moderating factors. The public TV, the one anchor, there was in social media. So with this explosion of communication, we've seen an explosion of xenophobia, of racism, and of hate speech. And I think that we can all agree that that has had a tremendous effect on social cohesion. And I'm not talking about Sri Lanka only, but around the world we have seen how that explosion of hate speech and disinformation is dividing society. It's harder and harder for societies to come together on a common platform. And we have seen politics being weaponized, discourse, divisive discourse and hate speech being weaponized to exploit those divisions rather than bringing people together. And that has a tremendous impact on social cohesion, on democracy. It has an impact on people's participation because there is intimidation, because the democratic space is shrinking. And again, this is a global phenomenon.
What can we do to mitigate this issue?
Well, quite a bit, and I think the experiences, there's very broad experiences, of course, around the world, but it's clear that this is the responsibility of a broad set of actors. I think first and foremost, I think citizens. Young people today and have a tremendous amount of information at their disposal. We all have a tremendous amount of information like we've never had before. But that also comes with a tremendous responsibility. And I think as individuals, the first thing is that we need to be a lot more sensitive. Are we retweeting some garbage? Yes. Are we retweeting misinformation? Are we pausing to think before we spread? Are we thinking, where does this information come from? Who has come up with this survey or with this information? So I think there is a sort of personal responsibility. Then I think as governments, as institutions, there's also a tremendous responsibility for a sort of pact for civic responsibility. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of education, in terms of legislation to foster greater civic responsibility, more informed citizens. And then, frankly, the media has a huge role to play in terms of professionalization, in terms of supporting journalists, in terms of investing in fact-checking. We have put a lot of responsibility as well on internet companies. And internet companies need to invest the money and the people to be able to manage and moderate conversations online in a responsible way. We're now going to be in an electoral period in Sri Lanka. Political parties have a huge responsibility to play. The kind of instructions, the kind of guidance that you give, and political parties need to have a sort of ethical and civic responsibility. We can call it a code of conduct about what discourse is acceptable and what discourse is not. So frankly, it is a very broadly shared responsibility across society.
Well, it is an election year, not only in Sri Lanka, but in many other countries as well. So it plays, especially dissemination of information plays a key role, especially because information, as you mentioned, is endless. It's endless scrolling, so you never know where you will end up. So it is important that this issue is addressed in the right manner. Who do you think should address this issue, Mr. Marc?
So, I mean, I think, as I say, I think the responsibility is very broad. But let's say, to speak about Sri Lanka in particular, I think there is quite a shared responsibility. And I think we need to start by the experience that we've seen in the country is that very often it is politicians, it is especially politicians during a political campaign that weaponize, divisions, ethnic and religious divisions in the country, and use it to divide further, to drive and to drive divisions. And this in Sri Lanka has caused violence in the past, has killed people. Hate speech and disinformation has killed people. And so there is a great responsibility, I think, in the political class, in political parties. And then the media and the internet companies, certainly. I see a lot of awareness across the media, but there is a very proactive stance that needs to be taken, especially during electoral campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Why is the United Nations getting involved so heavily in addressing, combating and mitigating hate speech?
Well, in part because of the global trend, this growth of racism, xenophobia, and divisive discourse. And I think the Secretary General, since he's come into office, I think we've never seen such divisive discourse across the world. Just during the pandemic, when you saw all this misinformation about vaccines, about masks, at a time where the public and the institutions were facing a tremendously dangerous moment. So this is just one example of how misinformation has been detrimental to the safety and to the health of people. And so the Secretary General has launched in 2019 its global strategy to combat hate speech and disinformation. And this is really focused on three aspects. Yeah? One is working with governments and civil society to develop better ways of tracking and addressing hate speech and disinformation, promoting more positive narratives, and third, help with monitoring and understanding of hate speech and disinformation that is going to be very different from one society to another.
Now, every day we wake up on our phone, we see a new update coming in. There's something happening every single day, a new development, especially in the field of AI as well. So with the rise of technologies like AI, a common question that we see every day and we hear every day is how safe it is. So what are the sort of challenges do you foresee in the future in relation to combating hate speech?
Well, I'm pretty worried, and I think the Secretary General is preparing now something called the Summit of the Future in September, and it's about emerging and global threats, and certainly one of the emerging global threats is artificial intelligence, and specifically in a broad set of fields, from war to every single field is going to be affected by artificial intelligence. But in terms of information, we are pretty worried. There's a lot of concern of how AI is going to be weaponized in political campaigns, is going to be used to divide further discourse in societies. And I don't know if you saw recent elections around the world, how new technology is using avatars and fake calls to voters using the voice of one of the candidates. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So imagine how difficult it's going to become for search engines, automated search engines that are looking at words in posts. Once you have AI multiplying the amount of messages, but also using other means, either video or others. So clearly we're facing a major challenge, and we are worried that the technology, but also the public awareness about these new tools is not at the level that it should be. So for us, this will require an even greater efforts by all across society to understand better, to spot it, but also to address it using new technologies. And certainly there are tools using AI that will be able to detect misinformation and hate speech. So, but they need to move at the same speed as those using this to divide and to promote hateful messages.
Well, it is a collective effort that everyone has to do their part, because sometimes you can't expect organizations and governments to do everything. It is sometimes personal responsibility. Self-responsibility also plays a key role, self-awareness, as you mentioned. Do you think we are capable, not just Sri Lanka, but on a global scale, do you think we will be able to handle a challenge, with AI, considering its security challenges coming in as well? Do you think we will be able to handle it?
It's a very good question. When I see the attraction of my son to the screen and to already, I don't know. I find it obviously, and I think every parent has faced this challenge. But I do feel that if we are to build the kind of institutions that we need to confront the challenges that we are facing, we will need to take seriously the threat of misinformation and hate speech. We will need to address it, because we will need to come together in an unprecedented way to face those challenges. So I am extremely worried because, like you, every morning I wake up to so much misinformation that you wonder what are the tools that we're going to need. But I am confident that the level of awareness is raising here in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And I do feel that we are much more aware of how this can be used in a divisive way.
Now, why do you think self-regulation and awareness is much preferred than, restrictive laws coming into play?
Well, I think first of all because it's more effective. So I think the experience around the world shows that codes of conduct, public education, work with institutions that provide transparent information to the public to take decisions is much more effective at curbing hate speech. To think that hate speech and disinformation is going to be curbed because of a legislation, I think is not realizing the amount of hate speech and disinformation. It's not realizing the magnitude. But the other issue is that, unfortunately, around the world, legislation that tries to tackle it is often used to suppress dissent and to suppress the opposition. And I think this has much worse consequences on freedom of expression, on the quality of democracy. So it's much more effective. It prevents abuses, and also it puts the onus on the broad set of actors that have the responsibility. But to think that one unit or one commission is going to wake up in the morning and be able to identify and to prosecute all the instances of hate speech and disinformation, I think is very naive.
As the resident coordinator of the United Nations here in Sri Lanka, I would like to ask you what sort of work is being done to, especially in view of combating hate speech on the 18th of June. What is the work that is being put into place, or what is the work that is underway done by the United Nations?
So for many years now, we've been supporting a broad set of Sri Lankan institutions to monitor, to understand, but also to do public education on what hate speech and disinformation is. There's a much greater capacity now in Sri Lanka to monitor hate speech and disinformation. We've been also facilitating dialogue between those institutions and the internet companies. But we've also been engaging with a broad set of actors, political parties, institutions, to also raise this issue very broadly. We would like to do a lot more, starting with awareness raising. I think this is our first kind of, we want to launch a new campaign, and today's conversation is part of this. We want to launch our own campaign on raising awareness on hate speech and disinformation. And finally, and this is also an invitation to those institutions and partners who want to work on this, we would want to build a lot more capacity in specific institutions, in the media, in the private sector. For example, what does it mean to have more responsible advertising that doesn't promote disinformation and hate speech? And so we have a lot of experience globally on that, and we would love to work more on that here.
Yes, because not just in Sri Lanka, we see it on a global scale as well. Many media organizations, for the purpose of increasing viewership, would sort of go to any length, missing code of ethics and respecting values and ethics of journalism as well. So it's important that organizations step in and step up their game as well. Which leads me to my question, something related to my field of expertise. Journalists also play a key role, media organizations play a key role, newsrooms, news departments, producers, everyone related to the field of journalism. It's a very broad field. And media sort of rules the world, if we see, even if it's on a digital platform. And it's very powerful that it has the ability to change the minds of people, influence decisions that they make. So I would ask you, how would you sort of advise media outlets and organizations to sort of get in the groove of hopping into ethical journalism and promoting, and combating hate speech, especially relating it to the Sri Lankan media?
Well, I mean, as you say, I think the media plays such an important role, and you have such a role of educator, of also, the media in many ways binds the nation together, yeah? And that comes with a huge responsibility. And there's so much that the media can do. But this challenge, again, is not a Sri Lankan challenge, it's a global challenge. But a lot can be done. For example, simply having a policy on this. Very few media houses have an actual policy on how do they confront hate speech and disinformation. Have a support structure for editors and for journalists. Engage with the experts and the institutions that have a lot of knowledge and have spaces of conversation, open conversations about how hate speech is tackled. So there are many ways that media companies can play a positive role. And frankly, now that we are entering an electoral campaign, I do feel that this is going to be more important than ever. So certainly for us, it's an invitation to the media community here in Sri Lanka, and we are willing to help to do a better job, I guess, at tackling hate speech and disinformation.
All right, as time is ticking and it is time to conclude, my final question, I would invite you to address our audience watching us today. What is your take-home message on the 18th of June, International Day of combating hate speech?
Well, I would just conclude by saying that it's everybody's responsibility. And so tomorrow morning when you wake up and you open your Facebook or your Twitter account, think before you click. Think where that information has come from. Is that reliable? Is that a checked or verified source of information? And I think just changing our own behaviors online makes a huge difference.
All right, thank you very much for joining us. And on that note, we are hoping that this will bring about a positive change. You are doing your part, the United Nations is doing their part, we are doing our part. So hoping that this collective effort will lead us to a beautiful outcome. And on that note, we were in conversation with Mr. Marc-André Franche, Resident Coordinator for the United Nations here in Sri Lanka. And that concludes this exclusive discussion right here from the ITN studios. Stay safe.